The scorching sun beat down on Zane's weathered face as he gazed out at the endless expanse of New Mexico territory, 1872. The vultures circled overhead, patient predators awaiting the inevitable. Caleb adjusted his hat, providing minimal relief from the relentless heat that seemed to boil the very marrow in his bones. 5 days in the desert had left him with nothing but an empty canteen, a weary horse, and a growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. "Just a little farther, Dust," he murmured to his palomino, whose coat had long since turned the color of the landscape they traversed. "Water's just beyond that ridge, has to be," the horse snorted as if disagreeing with his master's baseless optimism. Caleb couldn't blame him. They'd been riding on hope for too long now, chasing rumors of gold that had lured him away from the relative comfort of Santa Fe. Now, with provisions depleted and his confidence waning, Caleb was just trying to make it back to civilization alive. As they crested the ridge, Caleb's heart sank. Instead of the promised oasis, there was only more desert, stretching toward the horizon like a vast ocean of sand and scrub. But something caught his eye, a thin plume of smoke rising in the distance, perhaps 3 miles ahead. "See that, boy?" Caleb patted Dust's neck. "Where there's smoke, there's water, and maybe a meal that ain't jerky." Dust seemed to find new energy at the prospect, picking up his pace as they descended the ridge. Caleb kept his eyes fixed on the smoke, his mind racing with possibilities. A camp, perhaps, travelers like himself. Or maybe a homestead, though who would be fool enough to settle in this god-forsaken stretch was beyond him. As they drew closer, Caleb's trained eye caught sight of something else, the remains of a wagon, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the hot breeze. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. Wagon attacks weren't uncommon out here, where law was a distant concept. "Easy now," he whispered, more to himself than to Dust. The scene that greeted him made his blood run cold despite the heat. The wagon was half buried in sand, one wheel missing entirely. Supplies were scattered around it, suggesting a hasty raid. But what caught Caleb's attention was the small fire that still smoldered nearby, and beside it, a figure slumped against a large rock. Caleb approached cautiously, hand still on his gun. "Hello there," he called out. "You all right?" The figure stirred, and Caleb realized it was a woman. Her dress, once a vibrant blue, was now dust-covered and torn. Her hair, a rich auburn beneath the grime, was falling loose from what had been an elaborate arrangement. She looked up at him with eyes the color of the sky just before dusk, wide with fear. "Stay back," she warned, raising a small derringer that looked almost comical in her trembling hand. "I'll shoot, I swear it," Caleb raised his hands slowly. "Madam, I mean no harm, just passing through and saw your smoke, thought you might need assistance. Are you with them?" she demanded, her voice hoarse but determined. "The men who attacked us." "No, madam," Caleb said firmly. "I'm just a prospector headed back to Santa Fe, been out here 5 days on my own." He gestured to Dust. "Just me and my horse." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp despite her obvious exhaustion. Finally, the derringer lowered slightly. "They took everything," she said quietly. "My husband, they shot him when he tried to stop them." Caleb dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam. When did this happen?" "Yesterday morning," she replied, her voice cracking. "I buried him over there." She nodded toward a small mound of stones a few yards away. "I couldn't dig deep in this hard ground." Caleb removed his hat respectfully. "My condolences, Mrs. Nagle, Rebecca Nagle." She tucked the derringer into a pocket of her dress. "And you are, Caleb Zane, at your service." He looked around at the desolate scene. "You got any water left, Mrs. Nagle?" She shook her head. "They took it all. I've been using the morning dew I collected on the canvas, but—" She gestured helplessly. Caleb reached for his canteen, remembering too late that it was empty. "I'm out too," he admitted. "But I know there's a water hole about a day's ride from here. If we leave now, we might make it by nightfall tomorrow." Rebecca looked at him warily. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "Can't rightly leave a lady to die in the desert," Caleb said simply. "Wouldn't sit well with my conscience. And what do you expect in return, Mr. Zane?" Her voice was tinged with suspicion. Caleb understood her caution. The frontier was no place for naivety, especially for a woman alone. Nothing but the satisfaction of doing right, madam. When we reach civilization, you can go your way and I'll go mine. Rebecca stood shakily, one hand pressed against the rock for support. I don't have much choice, do I? We all have choices, Mrs. Nagle, but some are just better than others. Caleb extended a hand. Can you ride? It's been a while, but yes. She took a step forward and swayed dangerously. Caleb moved quickly to catch her before she fell. Her body was light in his arms, too light. Dehydration and shock had clearly taken their toll. Maybe riding solo isn't the best idea, he said. You can share Dust with me. He's strong enough for two, especially since we're both running a bit lean at the moment. Rebecca tried to protest, but her strength seemed to leave her all at once. I need to collect what's left, she murmured. What's important to you? Caleb asked. We can't take much. Dust is already carrying heavy. My husband's watch, she said, and there's a small box in what's left of the wagon. It has letters from my mother, everything else. It doesn't matter now. Caleb helped her to sit again, then quickly searched the wagon. He found the watch a fine silver piece with an engraving on the back and a small wooden box that he assumed contained the letters. As he was about to leave the wreckage, something caught his eye. A photograph in a simple frame, half buried in the sand. It showed Rebecca and a man who must have been her husband, both smiling, both looking impossibly young and hopeful. He brushed off the sand and added it to the small collection of salvaged items. When he returned, Rebecca was staring at the stone mound, her face expressionless. I only knew him 8 months, she said without looking at Caleb. We were married in St. Louis, heading to California to start a new life. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he simply stood beside her in silence, offering the quiet respect of shared grief, though hers was fresh and raw in a way his old wounds were not. We should go, he finally said, glancing at the sun's position. We've got a lot of ground to cover before dark. He helped her onto Dust, then mounted behind her. She sat stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the proximity but too weak to protest. Caleb was careful to maintain as much proper distance as the saddle would allow. Hold on to the horn, he instructed. I'll try to keep the pace steady. As they rode away from the desolate camp, Rebecca didn't look back. Caleb couldn't blame her. Some scenes weren't meant to be remembered. They rode in silence for several hours, the landscape unchanging around them. Occasionally, Caleb would point out a landmark or mention something about the territory, trying to distract her from the grim reality of their situation. She responded with monosyllables, if at all. By late afternoon, Caleb could feel Rebecca leaning more heavily against him, her strength fading as the day wore on. We'll stop here for the night, he decided, steering Dust toward a cluster of rocks that would provide some shelter from the wind. But the water, she protested weakly. We won't reach it today, Caleb explained. Better to rest now and travel in the coolest parts of the day. We'll set out before dawn. He helped her down, concerned by how light she felt in his arms. Her skin was hot to the touch, her lips cracked from dehydration. I have a little jerky left, he offered, digging into his saddlebag. Not much, but it'll help keep your strength up. Rebecca took the small piece of dried meat with trembling fingers. Thank you, she said, the first genuine gratitude he'd heard from her. As the sun set, the temperature dropped rapidly, a desert paradox that had claimed many unprepared travelers. Caleb collected what scrub he could find for a small fire, then spread his bedroll for Rebecca. You take it, he insisted when she hesitated. I'll keep watch. What about you? She asked, eyeing the single blanket. Got my coat, he replied, though they both knew the thin duster would provide little protection against the desert night. Rebecca sat on the bedroll but didn't lie down. Instead, she stared into the small fire, the flames reflected in her eyes. Why were you out here, Mr. Zane? You said you were prospecting. Caleb sat across from her, feeding small twigs into the fire. Heard rumors of gold near the Black Mesa, thought I'd try my luck. And did you find any? He smiled ruefully. Not a speck. Story of my life, I suppose. Always chasing after something just beyond reach. What will you do when we reach Santa Fe? Caleb shrugged. Find some work, save up, try again somewhere else. He looked at her curiously. What about you? Will you continue to California? Rebecca's gaze dropped to her hands where she still wore a simple gold wedding band. I don't know. Our plan was to join my husband's brother in San Francisco. He has a shipping business. She sighed. But now, I have no money, no possessions. Perhaps I'll find work in Santa Fe until I can afford passage back to St. Louis. What did you do before you married? Caleb asked. I was a teacher, she replied, a small smile touching her lips for the first time. I taught at a girls' school, literature and composition primarily. Santa Fe could use good teachers, Caleb suggested. Town's growing fast. Rebecca nodded absently, then winced, pressing a hand to her temple. You should rest, Caleb said, concern evident in his voice. We have a long ride tomorrow. This time she didn't argue. She lay down on the bedroll, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. Caleb watched her for a while, noting how the firelight softened the worry lines that had etched themselves around her eyes and mouth. She was pretty, he realized with a start, in a refined way that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape. He wondered what her story was, how a schoolteacher from St. Louis had ended up married and heading west with a man she barely knew. The night grew colder, and Caleb pulled his duster tighter around himself. He kept the fire small, wary of attracting unwanted attention. The desert wasn't as empty as it appeared, and the men who had attacked Rebecca's wagon might still be in the vicinity. Despite his intention to keep watch, exhaustion eventually claimed him, and he drifted into a light, troubled sleep. He awoke with a start hours later, his hand automatically reaching for his gun. Something had disturbed him, a sound, a movement. He scanned the darkness beyond the dying embers of the fire. Rebecca was sitting up, her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering violently. Mrs. Nagle, he whispered, moving closer. Are you all right? Sea cold, she managed through chattering teeth. So sea cold. Caleb touched her forehead and was alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. You've got a fever, he said grimly, likely from exposure and dehydration. Without hesitation, he sat beside her and wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her against his side. She stiffened momentarily, then relaxed as the shared warmth began to ease her shivering. This isn't proper, she murmured, but there was no real protest in her voice. Nothing proper about freezing to death either, Caleb replied. Just rest, we'll get you to water soon. Rebecca's head eventually came to rest against his shoulder as she drifted back to sleep. Caleb remained awake, listening to her breathing, occasionally checking her temperature with a gentle touch to her forehead. The fever seemed to stabilize but didn't break. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Caleb carefully extricated himself from Rebecca's side. She murmured something in her sleep, but didn't wake. He quickly packed up their meager camp and saddled Dust, who had spent the night grazing on what little vegetation he could find. Mrs. Nagle, Caleb said softly, touching her shoulder. It's time to go. Rebecca opened her eyes slowly, confusion evident in her feverish gaze. Edward, she whispered. It's Caleb Zane, madam. Remember, we're heading to the water hole. Recognition gradually returned to her eyes, followed by a flash of pain that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Of course. I'm sorry, Mr. Zane. No need to apologize. Can you stand? She nodded and attempted to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her. Caleb caught her, lifting her easily into his arms. Seems like you'll be riding in front today, he said, trying to keep his tone light as he carried her to where Dust waited patiently. Once they were both mounted, Rebecca leaning back against Caleb's chest for support, they set off into the desert. The morning was still cool, the sun just beginning to assert its dominance over the landscape. Caleb kept a steady pace, mindful of both Dust's endurance and Rebecca's condition. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't catch. When she was lucid, he encouraged her to talk, hoping to keep her mind active. Tell me about your school in St. Louis, he suggested during one such period. It was lovely, she said, her voice weak but steady. An old brick building with ivy growing up the walls. The classrooms had tall windows that let in so much light. In spring, you could smell the magnolias from the garden. Sounds nice, Caleb said. Better than what we had in Texas. One-room schoolhouse with more splinters than students. That drew a small laugh from her. Where in Texas? Little place called Sweetwater. You probably never heard of it. Actually, I have, Rebecca said, surprising him. There was a girl at my school whose family moved there. She wrote to us about it, said the sunsets were the most beautiful she'd ever seen. That's true enough, Caleb admitted. Nothing like a Texas sunset. Sky turns all purple and orange like God himself is painting it fresh each day. You miss it, she observed. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, left when I was 18, my pa died and the bank took our ranch, nowhere else to go but west. I'm sorry, Rebecca said softly. Was a long time ago, Caleb replied, though the old bitterness still lingered. How about you, what brought you west? Rebecca's body tensed slightly against his. Edward, my husband, came to St. Louis on business. He attended a social event at the school where I taught. He was very charming. Talked about California like it was paradise on earth. Quick courtship. Caleb asked, sensing there was more to the story. Very, she admitted. 6 weeks from introduction to wedding. My friends thought I was mad, perhaps I was, but I was 26, Mr. Zane. In St. Louis, that's practically a spinster. And you wanted adventure, Caleb guessed. Yes, she whispered. I wanted more than books and classrooms. I wanted to see the world Edward described, where opportunities were endless and the past didn't matter. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying. Rebecca grew quiet again, conserving her strength. Caleb scanned the horizon constantly, looking for landmarks he recognized. According to his reckoning, they should reach the water hole by mid-afternoon, but navigating the desert was always uncertain. Around noon, Rebecca's fever worsened. Her skin burned against Caleb's chest, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. He increased their pace, pushing dust harder than he wanted to, but knowing that Rebecca's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Stay with me, Mrs. Nagle, he urged when she slumped heavily against him. Not much farther now. So thirsty, she mumbled. Please, water, soon, he promised, tightening his arm around her waist to keep her secure in the saddle. Just hold on a little longer. The landscape gradually changed, the flat desert giving way to more varied terrain with scattered rock formations and deeper arroyos. Caleb recognized the area now and felt a surge of relief. The water hole was less than an hour away. When they finally crested a small rise and Caleb saw the cluster of cottonwood trees that marked the water source, he could have wept with gratitude. There it is, he told Rebecca, but received no response. She had fallen unconscious, her head lolling against his shoulder. Caleb rode directly to the water's edge, a small but reliable spring that pooled among rocks before disappearing back into the ground. He dismounted carefully, laying Rebecca on a patch of grass in the shade of the largest cottonwood. First, he allowed Dust to drink, knowing the horse needed strength to carry them further. Then he filled his canteen and returned to Rebecca's side. He lifted her head gently, pressing the canteen to her cracked lips. Drink, he urged, slowly now. At first, the water just ran down her chin, but then she swallowed reflexively, her body's instincts taking over. After a few small sips, her eyes fluttered open. Where? She began. The water hole, Caleb explained. We made it, just rest now. He wet his bandana and placed it on her forehead, then gave her a few more sips of water. He knew the dangers of allowing a dehydrated person to drink too much too quickly. As the afternoon waned, Caleb set up a proper camp. He unsaddled Dust, allowing the faithful horse to graze and rest. He collected wood for a fire, caught and cleaned 2 fish from the small pool, and even managed to find some wild onions growing nearby. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time she woke, she seemed a little stronger. By evening, she was able to sit up and eat a small portion of the fish Caleb had cooked. This is delicious, she said, her voice still weak but clearer than before. I didn't know you were a chef as well as a prospector. Caleb smiled, pleased to see her spirit returning. When you live on the trail, you learn to make do with what's available. These aren't bad eating, but they're nothing compared to the catfish back in Texas. How long will we stay here? Rebecca asked, looking around at their small camp. A day or 2, Caleb replied. You need to recover your strength and Dust could use the rest. Santa Fe is still 3 days' ride from here. Rebecca nodded, then looked down at her torn, dirty dress. I must look a fright, she said with a small, embarrassed laugh. You look like someone who survived the desert, Caleb said simply. That's no small feat. Their eyes met briefly across the fire, and something passed between them, a moment of understanding, of shared experience that transcended their brief acquaintance. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. "For saving my life." Caleb shook his head. "You'd have done the same for me, I expect." "I'm not so sure," she admitted. "I've never been particularly brave." "Bravery isn't about not being afraid," Caleb said. "It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear." "By that measure, you're plenty brave, Mrs. Nagle." They spent the next day resting by the water hole. Rebecca's fever broke during the night, and by morning, she was able to walk short distances on her own. She washed her face and hands in the cool water, then managed to somewhat tame her hair with Caleb's comb. Caleb gave her privacy as she attempted to clean her dress as best she could, hanging it on a branch to dry while she sat wrapped in his blanket. He busied himself checking Dust's shoes and replenishing their supplies, catching more fish and gathering what edible plants he could find. As evening approached again, they sat together by the fire, more comfortable in each other's company than they had been before. "Tell me about your prospecting," Rebecca said. "Have you ever found gold?" Caleb tossed another stick onto the fire. "Once, up in Colorado, near Pikes Peak, found enough to keep me going for almost a year." "Why didn't you settle somewhere then? Buy land or start a business?" He smiled ruefully. "The curse of the prospector, Mrs. Nagle, always believing the next big strike is just around the corner. I spent it all on better equipment and supplies, convinced I'd hit an even bigger vein." "And did you?" "Not yet," he admitted, "but hope springs eternal, as they say." Rebecca looked thoughtful. "My father was like that in a way, always chasing the next big opportunity. We moved 3 times before I was 10, following his dreams. My mother finally put her foot down when he wanted to go to California during the gold rush of '49. "Wise woman," Caleb remarked. "She was," Rebecca agreed, a note of sadness in her voice. "She died 5 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry to hear that." Caleb hesitated, then asked, "What about your father?" "Still alive, as far as I know. He left when I was 16, went west after all, just without us." She stared into the fire. "I received one letter from him, posted from Denver. That was nearly 15 years ago." Caleb was struck by the parallel to his own life, both of them left behind, forced to make their own way. Perhaps that's why he felt such a connection to this woman he barely knew. "Is that why you became a teacher?" he asked. "Stability." Rebecca looked surprised by his insight. "Yes, I suppose it was. Teaching offered security, respectability, everything my childhood lacked." She smiled sadly. "And then I threw it all away to chase a dream across the country with a man I barely knew." "You wanted adventure," Caleb reminded her. "Nothing wrong with that." "Adventure," she repeated softly. "It seems so foolish now." "Life's full of risks, Mrs. Nagle. Some pay off, some don't." "Doesn't mean they weren't worth taking." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the stars emerged overhead, brilliant and numerous in the clear desert sky. "They're beautiful," Rebecca whispered, gazing upward. "In St. Louis you can never see so many." "That's one thing I love about the frontier," Caleb said. "No matter how hard things get, you've always got this view at night." As they prepared to sleep, Rebecca hesitated beside the bedroll. "Mr. Zane, I insist you take the blanket tonight. I'm much recovered and you need rest as well." Caleb shook his head. "I'm fine, Mrs. Nagle, used to sleeping rough." "Then we'll share," she said firmly. "The nights are cold and there's no sense in either of us suffering unnecessarily. We're both adults, after all." Caleb raised an eyebrow, surprised by her practicality. "If you're sure, madam." "I am," she said, though a slight flush colored her cheeks. "Purely for warmth, of course." "Of course," Caleb agreed, hiding a smile. They lay down on opposite sides of the bedroll, the blanket spread over both of them, a respectable distance maintained between their bodies. Despite the propriety of the arrangement, Caleb found himself acutely aware of Rebecca's presence, the subtle scent of her hair, the rhythm of her breathing. Sleep came slowly to both of them that night. The next morning they set out early, their supplies replenished as much as possible, their spirits lifted by rest and food. Rebecca insisted on riding behind Caleb this time, her arms lightly circling his waist. "You're sure you're strong enough?" he asked as they prepared to leave. "Quite sure," she replied with determined cheerfulness. "I won't be a burden anymore, Mr. Zane." "You were never a burden, Mrs. Nagle." he said seriously. Their journey continued through terrain that gradually became less desolate. Scrub gave way to scattered pinyon pines and juniper, signaling their approach to higher elevations. They made good time, stopping only briefly to rest dust and take small meals from their meager supplies. During these breaks, they talked more freely than before, sharing stories of their lives, discovering common interests despite their different backgrounds. Rebecca spoke of her favorite books and the joy she found in teaching young minds. Caleb told her about his travels, the characters he'd met on the frontier, the beauty and danger of the untamed West. On the evening of the second day after leaving the water hole, they made camp in a small canyon where a stream provided fresh water. As they sat by the fire after their meal, Rebecca asked a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Mr. Zane, may I ask why you never married?" Caleb was taken aback by the directness of the query but answered honestly. "Came close once. Her name was Sarah, back in Sweetwater. We were childhood sweethearts, planned to marry when I turned 20. What happened?" Rebecca asked gently. "My pa died, we lost the ranch. Her father didn't think a homeless cowboy was a suitable match for his daughter." Caleb's voice held old pain but no bitterness. He wasn't wrong, really. "I couldn't provide for her. Did you love her very much?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "I thought I did at the time. Now I'm not so sure. We were young, and I think I loved the idea of her more than the person she really was." He glanced at Rebecca. "How about you?" "Did you love your husband?" Rebecca's gaze dropped to the fire. "I wanted to," she said softly. "I convinced myself I did, but in truth I think I was more in love with the future he promised than with Edward himself." She looked up, guilt evident in her expression. "Is that terrible of me to say?" "No," Caleb assured her. "It's honest. Sometimes that's all we can be." "When he died," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I felt grief, of course, but also relief, as if a weight had been lifted." Tears welled in her eyes. "What kind of person does that make me?" Caleb moved to sit beside her, hesitantly placing his hand over hers. "A human one, Mrs. Nagle, with complicated feelings just like the rest of us." She turned her hand to grip his, holding on as if it were a lifeline. "Rebecca," she said suddenly, "please call me Rebecca. After everything we've been through, Mrs. Nagle seems far too formal." "Rebecca," Caleb repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue. "Then you must call me Caleb." They sat in companionable silence, hands still joined, until Rebecca finally withdrew hers with apparent reluctance. "We should rest," she said. "Another long day tomorrow." That night, as they shared the bedroll again, the distance between them seemed to have decreased, though neither acknowledged it. The third day of their journey brought them within sight of civilization. By late afternoon, they could see Santa Fe in the distance, its adobe buildings glowing golden in the setting sun. "We'll be there before dark," Caleb said, pointing to the town. "You'll be able to sleep in a real bed tonight." Rebecca didn't respond immediately, and when she did, her voice was subdued. "Yes, that will be. Welcome." As they rode the final miles toward Santa Fe, a strange tension developed between them, a sense of impending separation that neither seemed eager to address. Their conversation, which had flowed so easily in the wilderness, became stilted and formal. They entered the town just as dusk was falling, the streets still busy with the day's final activities. Caleb guided Dust toward a modest hotel on the outskirts of the plaza. "This place is decent and reasonably priced," he explained as he helped Rebecca dismount. "The owner's wife is a kind woman. She'll help you get settled." Rebecca smoothed her wrinkled dress, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "for everything." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, hat in hand. "I'll see about getting your things from Dust." He retrieved the small wooden box and the framed photograph, handing them to Rebecca with care. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "There's not much," he said, pressing it into her hand, "but it should cover a few nights' lodging and some new clothes until you find work." Rebecca looked at the pouch, then back at Caleb, her eyes wide. "I can't accept this, please," he insisted. "I'd feel better knowing you're taken care of." "But what about you?" Caleb shrugged. "I've got friends in town who'll put me up. I'll find work at one of the ranches, maybe guide some Eastern tourists. Don't worry about me." Rebecca clutched the pouch, her knuckles white. "When will I see you again?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken feelings. Caleb cleared his throat. I'm not sure, I might head out again soon. There's talk of silver near Lordsburg. I see, Rebecca said, her expression closing off. Well, thank you again, Mr. Zane, for saving my life. The return to formality stung Caleb more than he expected. It was my pleasure, Mrs. Nagle. They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither moving toward the hotel door, neither willing to be the first to walk away. Finally, Rebecca straightened her shoulders. Goodbye then, she said, turning toward the entrance. Caleb watched her go, a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Just as she reached the door, he called out, Rebecca. She turned, hope flashing briefly across her face. I. Caleb faltered, courage deserting him. Take care of yourself. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. You too, Caleb. And then she was gone, disappearing into the hotel, leaving Caleb standing alone in the dusty street. He led Dust to the livery stable, paid for a good feeding and grooming, then made his way to a saloon he knew well. The familiar noise and bustle should have been comforting after days in the desert, but instead, it grated on his nerves. He sat at a corner table, nursing a whiskey, his thoughts continually returning to Rebecca. He couldn't explain the profound emptiness he felt at their parting. They had known each other less than a week, most of that time spent in dire circumstances. Yet somehow, in those few days, she had come to mean something to him that he couldn't quite define. After a sleepless night on a friend's spare cot, Caleb rose early and walked the streets of Santa Fe, trying to clear his head. Without conscious intent, his feet carried him back to the hotel where he had left Rebecca. He stood across the street, staring at the building, debating with himself. What would he say if he saw her? What could he offer her besides an uncertain future with a man who chased dreams across the desert? As he turned to leave, the hotel door opened, and Rebecca emerged. She wore a simple new dress of deep blue, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. Even from a distance, Caleb could see that she looked refreshed, more like the schoolteacher she had once been than the desperate woman he had found in the desert. She paused on the hotel steps, glancing around as if searching for something. When her gaze landed on Caleb, her entire face lit up with a smile that stopped his heart. Before he could overthink it, Caleb crossed the street to meet her. Good morning, he said, suddenly shy. Good morning, she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. I was just coming to look for you. You were, Rebecca nodded. I couldn't leave things as they were yesterday. It felt unfinished. I know what you mean, Caleb admitted. I couldn't stop thinking about you. They stood in silence for a moment, each gathering courage. I inquired about teaching positions, Rebecca said finally. There's a school on the outskirts of town that needs an English teacher. I have an interview this afternoon. That's wonderful, Caleb said sincerely. You'll be perfect for it. And you? She asked. Are you still planning to leave for Lordsburg? Caleb took a deep breath. I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time I stopped chasing dreams and started building something real. What sort of something? Rebecca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not entirely sure yet, Caleb said honestly, but I know I'd like you to be part of it if you're willing. Rebecca's eyes widened. Caleb, we barely know each other. I know, he acknowledged, and I'm not proposing marriage or anything so formal, just time. Time to get to know each other properly here in Santa Fe. Time, Rebecca repeated, considering the word. I think I'd like that. Caleb offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Rebecca took it. They walked together down the street, drawing curious glances from passers-by, the rugged prospector and the refined schoolteacher, an unlikely pair by any measure. I was thinking, Caleb said as they strolled toward the plaza, that gold and silver aren't the only treasures worth finding in this world. Rebecca's hand tightened on his arm. No, she agreed softly. They certainly aren't. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Caleb rode into the desert alone, his saddlebags packed for a journey, but not one of prospecting this time. He had a different purpose, a different destination in mind. He returned to Santa Fe that evening, just as the sun was setting. But he wasn't alone. Cradled gently in his arms was Rebecca, her head resting against his shoulder, her face alight with joy as he carried her across the threshold of the small house they now shared as husband and wife. The cowboy who had once ridden through the desert with empty hands had returned carrying something infinitely more precious than gold, a love that had blossomed in the harshest of conditions, proving itself as resilient and enduring as the desert itself. As he set Rebecca down in their home, surrounded by the life they were building together, Caleb knew he had finally found the treasure he had been searching for all along.